Hey everybody! Welcome to the Magical Solution here on Facebook and on YouTube. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with us today. Okay, so you guys, I am so excited tonight. Now I know I say this with every single interview, but like this time I'm just kidding. This time I'm so like over the moon because the person I'm about to introduce is someone that I've been following on YouTube for a really long time. And the first YouTube video I saw, I absolutely fell in love with this person. And the energy that came across was someone who was so wise, so real, so beautiful, and someone that I just could sit for hours and listen to. And I did. So I am so excited to bring her on tonight so that you guys get to sit in and we get an hour of just picking this brilliant person's mind. Okay. So I'm going to introduce her. Her name is Benebell Wen. She is the author of Holistic Tarot and the Tao of Craft. And she is the creator of the Spirit Keepers Tarot. She is an occultist. She is a tarot reader, she is an astrologer, and she's a feng shui consultant. And then, of course, if you want to learn so much more about her, you can go to her website at benebellwen.com. And speaking of that website, I know we're probably going to talk about it again at the end of the show, but her website is amazing. It is jam-packed, filled with knowledge. There's so much free material for the scholar who is trying to learn. There are workbooks, there are PDFs. There's just so much that she offers you on top of all of her YouTube videos. She is just a wealth of knowledge that she gives away for free. So I am personally blessed to have her on the show. I'm personally blessed to have found her on YouTube. And I hope y'all feel blessed that we're having her here tonight to just chit chat. So of course, I'm not going to talk anymore. We're going to bring her on without further ado. Here we go.
Hi, Leilani. I'm blushing now.
Yes. How are you, my beautiful goddess? How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing very well because I'm here on your channel.
So first of all, I definitely want to say thank you so much for saying yes to me tonight and coming on tonight. I'm over the moon. I know we had to play phone tag for a while, email tag for a while with our schedules. So when we finally locked a date, I was like, yeah! It was awesome. Thank you so much.
Oh, it's my pleasure for sure.
So tonight, I kind of played a trick on everyone, you guys. So everyone in the chat room, let's say hello to a few people. We've got Keith, we've got Lucianne, we've got Marius and Steven and Ori. A lot of people are here. So you guys, I kind of played a trick on you. So on the flyer, it says that we are going to be learning about Eastern Asian esoteric practices. But I do want to make it clear that we are kind of honing in and focusing on the Taoist practices. And we will kind of touch base on some other things, but we're kind of honing in on that. So as we get started, let's talk a little bit about you. I want to know everything about you. And I'm sure that that's like a whole video in and of itself. But what was your journey like, you know, connecting to your Taoist practices? Because I remember watching a video one time where you were explaining some of the practices, and you had mentioned that, you know, you really learned more about yourself and learned more about the Taoist practices as you were researching for your videos. So what was that journey like for you?
So I think what's interesting is we have to kind of backpedal a little bit to talk about, I think, Asian culture and Asians generally speaking and their relationship with religion. In the West, you see a lot of people identify very firmly in a fixed way with a specific religious establishment, and then they kind of only follow that gospel, right? Whereas in Eastern tradition, for example, my mother would call herself a Buddhist, and a lot of the practices are Buddhist-esque. And so I thought we were Buddhist. But the more I learned academically and religiously about Mahayana Buddhism, oh, she's not really Buddhist. She's actually very Taoist. And actually a lot of the practices in, for example, Taiwan, Southern China, it's extremely Taoist, but then they would say that they're Buddhist. There's a whole long history about that. I don't want to get into it, but that's where we're going to begin. And then from there, every aspect of my life, it wasn't so much my mom said, you are Buddhist or you are Taoist or this is a spell. It's more like something comes up and then she will pray to the gods for an exam, or she would do a divination for what college I should go to, or before a tennis match, she would talk to me about prayer or mantra recitations or how to eat holistically, not just about health and nutrition, but also about the spiritual health to help me empower what it is, what I want to do. So for me, it has always been what we call the holistic practice, where the practice of the religion or the mysticism is down to the aspect of diet and daily practices of mantra recitations, meditation, and things like that. I did shy away from that as I was in my younger years, because I think when you're trying to assimilate into suburban America, when you already look different, the last thing you want to be is so different that people can't even understand or make sense of you. So I learned fairly quickly that a lot of the mystical practices that I grew up with is, for lack of a better term, not okay in suburban America. And I started to learn how to kind of assimilate and downplay the more pronounced Eastern characteristics of my conduct and my practices. But then after college, I had a renewed interest in my own culture and wanted to return to that concept. And for me, at least, my finding was you can't truly embrace the Chinese culture without embracing Taoism. So that's why I went back to Taoist practices and also the academic study of Taoist mysticism.
Wow. So when you were talking about your mom and sort of like how enveloped it was in your life, your food, your exercise, your seeking advice, you kind of touched on a couple of things that we're definitely going to get into. So you touched on divination. You touched on reaching out to the ancestors. You touched on a few things that just seemed like a way of life for you guys. And so that's what Tao means, right? Tao means the way, right? That makes sense. That makes sense. So let's get into a little bit about Taoist practices in terms of how it became what it is today, because I know in a couple of your videos you spoke about some of the influences that Buddhism and Confucianism had on it. You talked about the influences of geography. You talked about cultural influences. You talked about a lot that kind of played into the melting pot of Taoist practices. And then you talked about how Taoism for a moment kind of went underground. The books were burned twice and had to get researched and reconstructed in a way into what it is today. Can you kind of let us in briefly on these influences? If you could pick maybe 1 to 3 hot button things that Confucianism and or Buddhism or any of these other things that I mentioned, if you could pick like the top 3 things that really made an impact on Taoism, what would they be?
I think the running joke in Taoism is that you really can't define Taoism. It's so hard to talk about. And I think there's a reason for that. When it comes to Taoism, I think the best way to describe it is how Taoism looks depends on your vantage point. And it constantly changes and shape shifts based on your vantage point, where you are in your own journeys. So that's why it's called the way. And Taoism is kind of like water, where it takes the shape of whatever it's put into. And so because of that, it is very eclectic. So wherever Taoism goes, it takes on the shape of the culture and the politics around it. So in China, because you had Confucianism, legalism, and all these other Buddhism as well, these influences shape Chinese Taoism. If you really study the philosophy as it leaves China and goes into other Chinese diasporas like Southeast Asia, even when it moves west into Western occultism, I wouldn't say Western occult interpretations of Taoism is wrong. I don't think it is. I think it becomes its own branch of Taoism, arguably speaking. And so wherever it goes, it takes on the shape of the culture, ethos, and the religions of that particular area, and the person as well. So that's sort of the bare bones, easiest way to define what Taoism is and what the influences are.
So it's kind of, you can consider it a living tradition in the sense that it adapts as it goes, and that's what's keeping it alive in a way. That's really amazing. Is Taoist practices, is this something that you would consider initiatory, or would you consider it something that people can do as a solitary practice? Meaning, like, do they need to seek out teachers to know Taoist practices, or can they do it on their own?
It's both, and it depends on who you ask. So I think my opinion is that people always seek community. We are tribalistic in our psychology. And so when we have something as dear and near to our heart, like what we believe, our personal gnosis, we want to form a community around that. So that's why I believe initiatory traditions are always going to come up around religious practices, right? And so you do have a very strong history of initiated lineages where you have to be initiated into a lineage in order to be considered a Taoist priest or a Taoist priestess. And you are going to find more orthodox Taoists say that if you're not initiated, then you can't be Taoist. I don't agree with that. I think you just have many perspectives. Just like in Christianity and any other religion, there's a diversity of voices and perspectives. I believe that you can be solitary. And in fact, a lot of history shows that the most notable alchemists in Taoist magic have all been solitary practitioners. They might dabble in a couple of lineages, and always not one, but multiple lineages to kind of get a sense of what they do. They kind of hodgepodge and form a collage of those beliefs, and then they form sort of their own school of thought. But they themselves never created an initiatory lineage. It's when they die, people come and celebrate them as some kind of a figurehead and then form an initiatory religion around those figures. So to answer your question, it's both.
It is both. Wow. So speaking of and we're definitely going to get into the little bit of the alchemist part of it as well. But speaking of, like, looking at individuals and sort of elevating them, and not necessarily worshiping them, but elevating them as very important figures in the practice, are there hierarchies or levels of spirits? So I know you mentioned before, your mom would talk about ancestors, and like if you had a question, go speak to your grandfather or someone who had passed away. Are there sort of concepts of gods and deities and ancestors and demons and all the fun stuff that you would see kind of a lot, pretty much all over the world? Do you guys have a concept of that as well?
The short answer is yes, but there's no defined pantheon. It really, for example, China is so big that you have to really look at the regions. So every single region will interpret Taoist magic and Taoist mysticism and also exoteric religious Taoism in different ways. So it may have the same sort of archetypal energy in terms of, a fire god, rain god, things like that. But then the names and the mythologies, legends, and stories all differ from region to region. So it's actually very similar to Hinduism. In the West, we think of Hinduism as this one cohesive religion, but it's actually not. Hinduism is an umbrella term for very localized practices. Are there some common spiritual concepts across all of those, localized practices of Hinduism? Absolutely. But their pantheons, how they even interpret the pantheons, like you said, the hierarchy of gods, devas, spirits, and so forth, on I think it's asparas, are all very different. So in Chinese Taoism, it's the same. Some people look at them as gods and goddesses, and you have different levels of spirits that are called lords or emperors. You have nature spirits, then you have the ancestral connection, but then you also have heavily Buddhist influenced Taoist magic as well, where they are going to use the terms Bodhisattva and Buddha, and they take on a much more Buddhist flavor, where, for example, they're going to be vegetarian, or actually they follow the Buddhist cuisine, which is even more than vegetarian. There's very particular dietary rules around that as well. So it really depends on what flavor of Taoism you're looking at. But yes, they definitely have a hierarchy of spirits.
Awesome. You mentioned mythologies and folklore, especially, like as we go from region to region, and these folk traditions are based so heavily on the local situation. Are these mythologies and folk tales, are they done orally, or are they done through writing?
For much of Chinese history, unless you were from an educated elite class, you were probably not literate. And so, for example, my maternal grandparents are not literate, and so it was absolutely an oral tradition. And I think your socioeconomic circumstances also very much shape the ceremonial magic, the witchcraft that you're practicing, and how it looks. So a lot of what you see written down in academic papers, treatises, and what you have on record, you're really looking at the higher classes, how the aristocrats practiced Taoist magic, and what was actually written by people who were educated and literate and privileged in every single regard. So you're really getting their voice. In terms of the more street level folk tradition of Taoist magic, there's very little written about that. And a lot of that is reconstructive, and it is passed down by oral tradition, even today.
Well, what about writing, though? What about writing and, well, I guess we'll get into mathematics and numerology a little bit later, but what about writing in terms of the esoteric practices? Is there a big influence on that? I remember when we your book, which, by the way, you guys, I showed a picture of it earlier, but you guys have no idea. Look at this thing. Look at it. A lot of stuff. But in this book, you cover food talismans, and you cover sigils and things like that. And in your videos, I haven't gone through the book yet, so I don't want to reference it and sound crazy, but in your videos, you spoke about how really influential writing was to the practices. Can you kind of elaborate on that a little bit? What do you mean by that?
I think probably a more accurate term is logos, the idea of the word. Thought and word are connected. So in terms of being able to use the word to communicate with heaven, that concept is very important. Obviously, a very quick connection to that or extension is going to be writing. And I think also there's always been sort of this celebration of literacy that always, we always connect that to something good. We connect that to something higher, transcended, or elevated. So in the magical practices, writing is extremely important, which is why food talismans is sort of the bread and butter of any form of Taoist magic. In any kind of ritual, even on how people decorate their altars, you're always going to find food talismans. It's that much baked into our concept of Taoist magic. What I find really interesting is the clear divide between food sigils that feature actual words that you can read, like they're words that you can read, versus Taoist sigils that are kind of it's like a magical glyph form of writing. My theory, this is just my theory, and my mom thinks it's a legitimate one. So my mommy thinks I'm right, But because I think you had people who were not literate, who were creating these food talismans, and because they were not literate, they were kind of mimicking, the motions of writing. So what they would do is kind of mimic the motions of Chinese characters, but then add their own flair to it, and that became a magical script that was really big in terms of Taoist magical practices.
Oh my goodness. So another thing that I did, and we're slightly changing the subject just a smidge, but another thing that I did on your flyer was the word esoteric. It took me a really long time to settle on that word because there was so much meat to this conversation, and the definitions of what we were talking about definitely varied based on the subject. And I eventually settled on esoteric because I said, you know what, let me not deviate from the book because she used the word esoteric. So let's talk about it. But you do make a distinction between exoteric and esoteric in terms of system. Can you give us a brief little explanation on that difference and why you chose esoteric in your practices?
The more common division you see in Western interpretations of Taoism is philosophical Taoism versus religious Taoism. My personal experience, like sort of my experience of Taoism, doesn't quite match that very clear divide between religious Taoism and philosophical Taoism. For me, it's either you kind of enjoy the material accoutrements of Taoist religious practices, the people who are kind of like, daytime Taoists, or that's not a fair point, but they're more into sort of the motions, right? The performance of Taoism. And I call that exoteric Taoism, and it's valid, it's important. I think everybody loves the performative aspect of Taoist magic. Then there is the esoteric, which is very much an internal alchemical practice. It's about immortality, but we think of immortality as a metaphor. It's this idea of transcension in some kind of way to escape the cycle of life, to escape space-time, the limitations of space-time. And you do that through the acquisition of wisdom, through all these different forms of esoteric practices. So that's why I call that esoteric, because it's doing the work with the capital W. And that's very different from people who are more interested in the performative and also sort of the instant gratification value of religion.
I absolutely love that definition. I love the way you explain that. Because I know for us, in Espiritismo, which is one of the practices that I do, there is a very, very big distinction on people who kind of just go with the motions, love to have the altars, love to have the incense, love to do the songs and play. But then there's that other element to it that's all about that elevation, that spiritual elevation that can only be done, like you said, through that inner alchemical process, that work with the capital W, that confronting of self, that eating right, taking care of yourself, that holistic aspect. And I love the way that you explain that both in your video and here. And I think that that's important in terms of this conversation as well, because we're talking about these Taoist practices, and we're talking about the context of how the history influences and all these other cultural influences and things like that. But ultimately, what we're really saying is like you can do this too, and it's something that will elevate you and your spirit and in your own way. And I think that that's so amazing. That's so amazing.
And like you just pointed out, it's a universal philosophy. Like you said, like if you find that same belief system in your tradition as well, I think every tradition, and you see that in Western occultism. I mean, I think that's very much a common denominator anytime you're talking about mysticism, no matter where you go in this world, which to me tells me that we're all onto some kind of a core truth there.
Yeah, you are so on it. It's true. Let's kind of get into a little bit, because I know one of the difficult things about just like an average American who might be researching East Asian philosophies and specifically Taoist practices because they're interested in getting involved. One of the most difficult things is sort of learning some of the concepts of Taoist practices. And so let's kind of go into a few of these concepts, but let's do it in a way where we kind of compare it to Western esoteric stuff, just so that they have a little bit of reference. So one of the things that I think is a really big one, and you kind of see it across the board, but I definitely want to talk about this a little bit in depth, is whether or not this is a monotheistic, polytheistic, atheistic, shamanistic, animistic, whatever. What is the overall, if you could kind of lump it in the various isms that's out there for religion, what would Taoist practices be considered?
Well, because it does, how it looks depends on where you stand. And so it's all of the above. I think it's very clear it's polytheistic, right? You have all of the different gods and goddesses, so it's polytheistic. But I also think that all Taoists would agree that if you're using the terminology, it can be considered monotheistic as well, because we do believe at the heart of it, all of this sources back to one united concept of a monotheistic monad, a one true God, the Tao. But it's atheistic because we don't see the God as like this bearded man, like sky God running around. You understand? Like we don't have that concept. Right. It's very, very abstract. It's kind of like gravity. Is gravity like, this human looking God or goddess, or is gravity this abstract concept that is very much a part of our lives? So we see that concept in how we interpret the God concept. And so it is monotheistic, but it's also atheistic because it is very distinct from how monotheism is talked about in, for example, the Abrahamic faiths. So it's all of the above. And it's shamanistic because we do believe in a hierarchy of different worlds. We believe in underworld. We believe in a celestial realm. And for the human mind to traverse to these places, there needs to be a form of shamanistic practice to get there. So it is all of the above.
Wow. I think it's like a wonderful buffet. And I love that. That is just so much fun. So what about, okay, let's talk about this one. What about dualities? Because everybody's got it, right? Like as much as people want to say that their spiritual system is without dualities and that it transcends duality and all that fun stuff, we tend to find it anyway. So I'm curious to know, does Taoist practices have this idea of duality? So for example, is there any such thing as black and white kinds of magic, good and evil, high and low, I don't know, the sun and the moon, all those concepts? Do you guys have that?
So it's the principle of yin and yang, yin yang, right? And I was listening, this is kind of a soapbox rant. I was listening to somebody in our community talk once, and this person said, I don't believe in yin and yang. I don't believe in the fixed binary. And then she went on to explain, it's because I don't believe you're firmly feminine or you're firmly masculine. I don't believe in black and white. And therefore, I don't believe in the concept of yin and yang, the duality. And that's a very distorted view of the Chinese idea of yin yang. So I think a better way to talk about the duality that we're speaking of when we're talking about Taoist mysticism and Taoist ontology is the binary code of ones and zeros in computer programming. So everything in computer looks back, like all computers, everything reads only ones and zeros. It's very clear, it's only ones and zeros. But the letter A, is the letter A yin or is it yang? The letter A is actually it's a string. It's an 8-digit string of ones and zeros, right? As I believe A is actually mostly 0, B is mostly 0, and then you get to O, which is mostly ones. But all of them is an 8-digit string of zeros and ones. And then so what we say, when we say yin or yang, there's a very clear tacit presumption that nobody is 100% yin or 100% yang, except for at the celestial level, which is not of this earth. Anything of body, physical substance has not any sense of 100% 0, 100% 1. This is yin and yang. We're all a mixture. However, you're going to have a majority of yin or a majority of yang, right? Yin yang. And so, for example, some characters are mostly zeros. So then, for example, just for short convenience of reference, I might say this string is 0. This string is 1. But we know culturally, I don't mean it's 100% 0. It's actually 0, 1, 1, 0. Do you know what I'm saying? So that's how we see yin yang. But I think when it gets translated into Western culture, you're going to see this in the 4 elements versus the 5 phases in the metaphysics of East versus West. But I think in Western culture, you see things as more fixed and definitive. We don't like to see things as fluid. And so when I say something for convenience of reference, like, oh, I'm female, you know, I know, and in a Chinese cultural standpoint, we all know there's a mixture of yin and yang. But in Western culture, I think you automatically go to the conclusion she's 100% yin or 100% yang. And I think that's the difference. We have a very distorted view of what the Chinese culture means when we say the binary. The binary definitely exists at the 0 and 1 level. However, no single person is only one or the other. We're all a string of the ones and zeros. So that's the binary.
Chick. I think you just blew everyone's mind just now with that one. No, seriously, because like to put it in that perspective. So this is why I love you. So this is why you're amazing.
I'll drink to that.
Oh, cheers, y'all. Anyone who has a drink, cheers. Seriously. So, okay, how about this one? Maybe I can trick you. Not really, because you wrote all of this. How about the Trinities? So in Western cultures, we talk about, you know, the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. We have so many versions of Trinities in our culture. And there's Trinities you can find in a lot of places as well. How about you? Is there a concept of a Trinity, and what does that look like? How does that play in the system?
Oh yeah, everything. All concepts of magical theory rests on the Holy Trinity or the Trinitarian principle. So for example, when we're talking about internal alchemy, so for example, the energies that run through your body, it's Jing, Qi, Shen. So there's 3 different types of energies, Jing, Qi, and an Shen. So if that helps, then we have the idea of heaven, earth, and man, right? And so everything is always in the Holy Trinity. And one of the foundational principles is that, remember I said that, you know, we look at the cauldron as a symbolic of what Taoist practice is. The Tao is what goes inside the cauldron, but Taoist practice, what I practice is the cauldron. Now in Chinese I guess pottery, the classical or ancient cauldron is a tripod, so it has 3 legs, and so we always use that as the metaphor. Any practice, any pursuit requires the 3 legs of that tripod. So the Holy Trinity is the foundation of anything you want to do to create or alchemize something in this life.
So, and the Trinity in Taoist practices would be heaven, earth, and man, right?
That's one way, but there's so many iterations of the Holy Trinity. It's so important that every principle is subdivided into the 3. So yes, I think there's the heaven, earth, and man, and then there's also the Jing, Qi, Shen, the 3 different types of energies that sort of dictate how everything. All magic is based on whether you want to use the Jing, you want to use the Qi, or the Shen. And so these ideas are they are very pervasive in every aspect. But the way we say it at the core is heaven, earth, and man, to sort of equate it to the the Holy Spirit, Father, the Son, and Holy Spirit.
Right. Can I ask? Is it too much to ask? Because the thing is, I want everyone to buy your books, because you guys, seriously, buy these books. And then here's the other one. The Holistic Tarot. And again, look at that bitch. Look at it. Amazing. I love it. So if it's too much to ask, it's okay. Can you briefly kind of let us know what those 3, the Qin, the Qi, the Yang, I don't want to butcher it. Never mind.
Heaven is this idea of the celestial influence, right? Earth is the material world around us, flora, fauna. It's using rocks, stones, magical herbs, things like that. So it's literally the earth, right? But it's also the underworld. It's also subterranean level influences as well. Nature spirits would fall under earth, not necessarily heaven. Heaven is more the higher vibrational realms of spirits, using some new age lingo. And then man is us. Man is thought. Man is will, intention, and what we bring to this mixture. When you're talking about Jing, Qi, Shen, Jing is the reproductive. It's semen, to put it very crudely, but the more metaphorical aspect, it's what creates. It's the creative energy. It's the creative juices. It's what reproduces, and that can also be very magical as well. Then there's Shen, which is, we believe that in every one of us there's a connection or a seed or a little piece of heaven inside all of us. So Shen is how you connect to heaven. You use Shen to transcend. You use Shen when you meditate, when you try to sort of immortalize or elevate yourself toward transcendence. You're really trying to develop and cultivate your Shen energy. Qi is what gives us life. It's after the birth of life, after reproduction. How do you maintain livelihood and life? That's the Qi. So those are the sort of the trinity that we see in Taoist: inner alchemy and outer alchemy.
Oh my gosh. And you guys, it goes even deeper than this. I highly encourage you to watch all of her videos, go on her webpage and buy these books, because Belle, you are totally watering this down as best as you could to stay within this hour, because we just have to, but there's just so much to it. It's so juicy and it's so much fun to learn. So I highly encourage everyone to do this. So let's move on, because I definitely want to keep going. What about, and this is my favorite part of it all, is the elements. So here in Western culture, we have the 4. We have the earth, air, fire, water. Sometimes the spirit. We'll add the 5th one in for fun, right? Depending on where you practice. What are the elements and the correspondences in the Taoist tradition? Because I know that it doesn't just do 5. There's like a 5/6 phases thing, and then it moves into an 8 phases thing. So I'm so curious to see what that transition is and what that's all about. If that's a big question, we'll try and break it down.
So I've thought about how do I reconcile the East and West in a way that can make sense. So, bear with me on this thought experiment. Okay, so first you want to picture a circle. There's a circle in your mind, and this circle is kind of the cycle of life. It's the calendar, it's the 4 seasons. It's about time and space is the circle, right? It's a cyclical aspect. Now at the bottom you put an X. The X is you. And the reason it's you and you break up the circle is because no matter how we move or shift through this world, everything is only through your perspective. It's always a geocentric, egocentric perspective. And you have to remember that limitation of your vantage point. So you put the X, and that's where you are, and you break up the circle, and the circle forms around you. Now in that circle, put 4 dots, kind of like a square. So if you connect the dots, it would form a square. The 4 dots are 4 fixed points, right? That's the 4 elements of Western tradition: fire, water, air, and earth. And so when you think about Western alchemy, you focus on the fixed points. Now, in Eastern alchemy, we don't focus on the fixed points. We focus on the changing phases. So every one of our elements, the 5 elements, are states of change. So if you have that X, right, and then you break up the circle and you have the 4 points, you form 5 broken lines in the circle, right? And those 5 broken lines are shifting. Those are the changing states from one fixed point to the next fixed point. That changing transformative moment between 2 fixed states is what we call the elements. So there's 5 changing states, 5 elements that reconcile with the 4 fixed points in Western alchemy. So both are the same. It all goes back to the universal circle, which is the truth, or however you want to talk about, the work or the way. However, we look at we have a different vantage point. I think Westerners want to talk about the 4 fixed points. The Eastern mystical perspective is to look at the changing phases, but they all form the circle, and we're all looking at the same exact thing. So that's kind of how I see the discrepancy between the 4 fixed states, the 4 elements of Western traditions, and then the 5. And for us, the 5 is wood, fire, earth, water, and metal. And they represent changing states. So wood is about sprouting. You know how sprouting is motion, it's a movement, right? So when something is changing, is shifting from one gear to another, that change that is a form of sprouting or growth, that's wood. And we were talking about expanding. So now you've grown up and you're expanding, you're blooming. That's fire. The motion, the change, the state of change of expansion is fire. Then we are talking about reaping. When you sow, the fruits of your labor, the reaping process is earth. And then how there's the rotting, the decomposition part, the conflict, because they're all humans. We go through a state of peace, then we go through a state of war, peace, war, and so the deconstruction is metal. And so anytime you have conflict or decomposition, that's going to be metal. And then reflection is after this process, there's a moment of respite or reflection. That's where wisdom is cultivated, and that's water. So those are our 5 elements, but they're really talking about states of movement.
That's amazing. Like I can totally conceptualize that in terms of inner alchemy.
Okay, great.
I'm still having a difficult time conceptualizing that in terms of the exoteric part. So like, for example, setting up an altar. A lot of times people like to set up the altar based on those 4 fixed points. They like to create a space that symbolically kind of recreates those 4 fixed points. Now, maybe it's different in Taoist practices. Maybe altars are not set up using the 5 points.
They are.
They are?
For sure.
Oh, so I'm curious. Yeah, I'm just curious to know how that looks in terms of like a physical place and like your practices. What would that look like?
Every tradition is going to be a little bit different. So just like, how there are certain herbs and stones, colors, everything that we attribute to fire, right? And then there's things that we attribute to water, air, and earth. And so in Eastern metaphysical practice, it's exactly the same thing. The most common one that I've seen that I have firsthand experience with is we use fruits. Fruits or flowers. And I can't remember them. I never remember it. I think peaches, I'm not even going to try because I don't remember it. But like use different fruits to represent the 5 phases, the 5 elements. Some people use different kinds of flowers, colors, even how things are arranged, because everything is based on the magic square, which is a 9-grid sort of magic square that is also superimposed over the 8 elements. That I think is more fixed. We also have this concept of the bakwa. The bakwa is more what we talk about when we say fixed points, because how we talk about 8 points in the cyclical calendar, this lunar solar calendar. And so that 8 is really more and we see that, for example, in Western Wiccan traditions as well, right? The wheel of the year. So we have that same idea of the 8 that break up the circle. And so those 8 fixed points that break up the circle are our 8 elements.
I love this. So just speaking of, just since you brought it up, let's just go there. We might as well go there. The square, right? The 9 points in the square. So when I see that, and I remember in one of your videos you spoke about a specific kind of sigil that you can use with the square. You spoke about numbers and numerology and why they are what they are. Honestly, I don't even have a question for this. I just find the connection so cool, because originally, way back in the first part of our conversation, I was going to ask, what was the influence of mathematics and or numerology on Taoist practices? And I do feel like that magical square definitely is one example of that. Am I close?
Very close. So I think one of the very simplified way of describing the great work of the Taoist, what is it that you're striving for? It is the reduction back to the one. It's returning to source energy, returning to one. So it's kind of finding the common denominator. So everything needs to reconcile with in theory, everything should reconcile with each other and have a common denominator. And that common denominator is the Tao. So if it doesn't break down and reduce into a common denominator where there's an intersection between things, then it's not the truth. Continue your search, right? And so that's kind of sort of the nuts and bolts of your mission as a Taoist. And so reconciling numerology, astrology, the correspondences of flora and fauna, all of this is kind of the subconscious culture of Taoist practice, because all of it should reduce to a common denominator and bring you to your Tao. And that's why you would work in astrology. So there's astrological correspondence to the magic square. There's numerological correspondence. Everything you can think of, there's a correspondence for it within that 9-sector grid.
Whew. Oh my gosh. So I'm going to ask this question because I have this gut feeling someone is already going to ask. And I kind of want to catch them before they do. It's this idea of, so we're learning about all of these, the core structure, if you will, of the magical Taoist practice, the very basic elemental ABCs of it all. I just have to ask, do people use this in a harmful way? Like, are there, quote unquote, in a very racist, systematic way of saying this, is there black Taoists? Is there darker energies being used? Like, can they utilize demons and heavier spirits with these energies that we're talking about here and now?
If you look back into the first 3 earliest dynasties in China, there's, of course, works with demons, upper, lower, very different hierarchical levels of spirits. But there wasn't this very clear, like, this is good, this is bad, this is black, this is white. I really feel like that infiltrated Taoist practice after imperialism. And imperialism is so entrenched when you're talking about East Asian culture, you really can't divorce it anymore. When you look at Chinese culture today, it's through an imperialized lens. You can't change that. And a lot of the Southeast Asian cultures is through a colonized lens. You can't remove that from it. That's ingrained into the people now living, breathing, and moving in Asia and practicing Asian magical traditions. So I think today, if you're talking to contemporary practitioners, you are going to hear, this is white magic, this is black magic. You're going to hear that very divisive, judgmental idea of what magic does, because that's from the imperialized, colonized perspective. Not to get super political all of a sudden.
No, girl, do it.
No, it's just, I'm not being political. It's just kind of a matter of fact statement.
Yeah.
But if you really try to go back in time, you really didn't see that. In the shamanistic practices, before we had such entrenched European presence in Asia, you didn't see that as much. You really saw a more sort of neutral perspective of demonology, a more neutral, even-tempered perspective of magic. It was more talked about, the binary is talked about as creation and destruction, not good versus evil. You're either creating something, you're creating what exists, or you're destroying what exists. Now, sometimes you do want to destroy. For example, if you think about healing the body of a virus or an infection, you're destroying the virus, right? And so there's a destructive element to that, but is that evil? That's actually very good. And also, what's good versus evil, it depends on your perspective. So for example, a lion eating, a little lamb is that a good act or an evil act? Well, if you're the lamb, that's very, very evil. I just got it, But if you're the lion, that's really good. I just had lunch, And so I think in Taoist magic, if you really look at how the Chinese framed these philosophies before imperialism, they did see it as a lot more nuanced.
Yeah. I was gonna say, in terms of political, I'll even go there because we are in it right now. I mean, when you have even a system that is no longer serving its people, sometimes you got to take it down. Like that's not good or evil. It just is what it is. It's part of that destructive process.
Yeah.
And hopefully someday we'll create something better and be a part of that elemental energy, you know? And I love it. I think that's amazing. And to not put that perspective on good or evil, just this is what we need to do because this is what we have to do right now. And then afterwards we will create and do. And there's steps, there's processes, there's phases that we're going, you know, we're moving into. And that's awesome. That
like
is
you're talking about right now, it is a destructive process. But I think what people jump to too quickly, if I say this is a destructive phase that we're in, they go, "Oh, you think it's bad?" I'm like, "No, you think it's bad." You know, I don't think it's bad. But if you're observing, like if you're speaking facts, like if you're observing it and talking about what you factually see, it's destructive. But that destruction is to lay the groundwork and to fertilize the ground so that you can grow something that's going to be a little bit more progressive, that's going to be have a better equilibrium. Right now, clearly, if there's a destruction going on, we have lost equilibrium. And so nature it's constantly moving back and forth to try to rectify itself and bring itself back to equilibrium. It's been uneven for so long that now it's a very natural process in human history that is just trying to
swing right back.
Right. And when it does that, that's a very uncomfortable process. Why do we say growing pains? I mean, puberty is a really shitty time in everybody's life.
Yeah. It's so true. So, we covered the demons, and I want to come back a little bit to your mom when you first were describing your growth and you connecting and reconnecting with your practices. Divination. You had mentioned that is part of it. What divination though? Like what systems do you guys use and like what does that look like?
So I think the simplest one is the moon blocks, where we have 2 crescent moon blocks, and then it's a way of communing with spirits. You know, you ask a question, there's a whole ritual around it for it to be activated, right? But in simplest form, you just throw the 2 moon blocks, and then how it shows up is going to say yes, no, or we say laughing gods, which means the gods are laughing at you. If the answer is basically a maybe, and there's some work to be done, or it's not for you to know at this time, that kind of an answer. PETA people, please avert your ears. But before the moon blocks, it was actually tortoise shells. So you use 2 turtle shells, and you know how the turtle shell, you have the curved end and then you have the flat. So how the 2 tortoise shells fall, that is how you would do the divination as well. In the cultures that are coastal or oceanic cultures, they use clam shells. And so you have the different tools based on the region, but it's that 2 pieces, that binary 0 and 1, and it goes back to a form of divination to ask the gods for a yes or no answer. If it's a more nuanced question, not necessarily a yes or no, but a how do I question or a why question, we use I Ching. So I Ching divination is something that we use as well. Water scrying, fire scrying, those are all very core concepts in Chinese mysticism.
Awesome. And do these divination systems require you having to call down a spirit for assistance during those processes, or are you able to do them on your own?
The traditional answer is yes. You need to petition a spirit. My 2020, 21st century answer is nah, just you do you, not really. But it would be remiss to say, well, traditionally we would say, yeah, you need to invoke or evoke. You need to petition a spirit, a god, goddess, some kind ancestor, some kind of spirit. And the divination, the whole point of the divination is communication. Divination is communicating with that spirit. So if I'm not communicating with that spirit, that's not divination. But that's a very, very antiquated view of how divination methods work. I think you have to update it for the 21st century. And so I think today you can be like, I'm communicating with my inner self or my higher self, which is perfectly cool.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So can you take us through, let's say you are setting up your altar, or let's say you are about to do some sort of foo sigil or a foo talisman, or let's say, you're about to do some divination. Do you have any recommendations in terms of prep work or post work for setting yourself up and setting your body and your space up in order to do those practices? Is there any techniques that you would suggest?
Wow. Okay. So, you know how you often hear people say, I did this spell and it didn't work, but I followed all the instructions. I don't know why it didn't work, right? I think the answer to that question is really complex, because if you even think of it in terms of quote unquote scientific, rationales, it depends on how much energy and power you've brought to that moment, right? And so if you go back to the basics of your body and your mind and your spirit are very strong through the holistic practices of your health, how you eat, how you meditate, how you sleep, if all of that core aspect to who you are is extremely strong, then in magical theory, I can snap a finger and things will happen. Or it's just the intention of the mind and the word that can make things happen. So then for me to craft a fused sigil, I don't need to go through all of the pomp and circumstance. The pomp and circumstance is not so much for show. Some people do it for show, but what it is, the idea is that, for example, I bring in a particular rock because the rock has an energy. We're very animistic like that. So if you think about the idea of sacrifice, right? Animal sacrifice, you kind of follow that concept. Take away the animal, but think of the concept of sacrifice. You're using the energy, the spirit, the power of these things to add to this thing that you have sort of alchemized with a very single-minded intention. So your idea is, if I take all of these little, accoutrements and aspects and put it into this one pot to do my spell, then that is going to give me power if I can't summon the power from it within, or the gods are not listening to me. So do you see how there's different methods for spell crafting? So what powers a spell depends on intention, depends on the moment. Like, there's different methods to the madness. Sometimes it's the things that you put into it, drawing energies from different objects and putting it into a pot to create the spell, pot being a figure of speech. Or sometimes it's petitioning a god. And the idea is you're saying a god, goddess, or spirit, a very powerful spirit, ancestors are powerful, comes down and does the work for you in a crude manner of speaking. And other times it's your own inner self, because you've cultivated enough strength and chi in yourself that you can kind of just manifest it on your own. And so it depends on the individual how that spell is going to be effective. It's not one answer fits all, right? And so that's kind of the core idea of how that works.
So, with that said, I find that these little nuances, right? Like, I find like these pieces that you're speaking on, and like you said, because they're so different based on your location, based on the lineage, based on so much, the influences. If someone is trying to learn Taoist practices, let's say someone watches this video, they get super inspired, and they're like, oh my God, I want to learn. And I know that technically they can do it through a teacher and through initiation, and technically they can still do it solitarily. If, let's say, they are seeking a teacher, what would that relationship, that master-student relationship, what does that look like? Like, what should they expect in that process of seeking a teacher? Like, what kind of things should they have in place, or what kind of things should they expect from a teacher? What's your opinion on all of that? Because I know it can be very complex based on the teachers and based on a lot of things, but I'm just curious what your opinion is on that one.
I think I have a very prejudiced and narrow-minded view on this. I think a lot of it is sort of reactionary to what you see today. There's so much noise, and so much of it gets commercialized, and people are doing it for motives that aren't always true. And so if you're entering a master-student, teacher-student relationship where the teacher is doing it for the money, like they literally need the money or want the money, I mean, they're filtering everything they do for you through that lens. And is that really what you want? Because, for example, if there's a master-student relationship, but I need your money, I need your paycheck, right? And you're doing something wrong. Am I really going to tell you you're doing something wrong? Because that's going to make you unhappy. That's going to make you uncomfortable. And if I keep on criticizing you to try to get the best out of you, because I have to put you through fire and brimstone in order to get the best out of you, for you to transform into gold. If I put you through that process and you're like, fuck this, she's crazy, and you leave, I no longer have your paycheck. Am I really going to do that? Or am I going to just say what you want me to say, so that you're happy and you're going to continue paying me to do this work? So I think, in terms of a master-student relationship, if you're truly going to invest yourself, you want to find a teacher who truly believes that at the end of this road, you have to be better than the teacher. And so whatever you think of the teacher, however impressive that the teacher looks, that teacher's goal for you as a student is that at the end of your time together, you will surpass the teacher. You have to surpass the teacher. If you don't surpass your teacher failed at his or her job. And so that is sort of the mark that I look at, the threshold and the standard that I apply in looking for a teacher. And I'm not saying people have to do that, but I think if you look at it, at least from that starting point, it's pretty easy to start sifting away some of that riffraff, and you won't waste your money, right? And so I think that's the way to look for a teacher. And if you can't find that, I think you need to have enough confidence in yourself to really go at it in a solitary way. I mean, most of what I do in terms of the academic study of it is very solitary. You know, I don't rely on my parents. I don't rely on the lineage of my mother, because that's something I wanted to shy away from for a whole slew of reasons. But lineage traditions was not something for me. So if I knew lineage traditions was not for me, the theory behind a lineage, initiatory tradition, is that there's already a pre-existing pillar of power, right? And so if I'm initiated, I go through this particular initiation process that has been designed by the lineage or the tradition. If I go through the process and come out at the end, I will be connected to that pre-existing pillar of power. And so it's like easy magic. Well, it's not easy magic, but you know what I'm saying, right? Like I'm connected to the pillar of power. I can siphon my power as a magical practitioner from that pillar, that collective pillar created by the practitioners within the lineage. So if you don't have that because you're not part of an initiatory tradition, it's still okay, but now you have to find your pillar of power somewhere else. So if you think about it that way, and you're very creative and scrappy, and you know, you're very resourceful, I think you can be just as powerful, if not more powerful, than people who are initiated. And I believe that because people who are initiated, it's kind of like privilege. You know, you get so relaxed and comfortable and reliant on this effortless privilege that you forget to work for things. Yeah. Whereas I think people who don't have certain privileges in life, whether it's race or socioeconomics, you learn to overcompensate. You have to overcompensate as a marginalized person just to be treated as an equal. So when you come at it with that kind of an ethos, it's very easy to be a solitary practitioner because you're constantly working overtime just to get the same results. So if you apply that ethos, that sort of philosophy, you can absolutely be a solitary practitioner.
Oh, I agree with you, because you see that even here in some of the, you know, the ATR religions as well, the, you know, with regards to the lineages and with regards to the initiatory practices, you'll have those masters who are there for the money. And some very shady stuff occurs in the meantime because they just want to keep that money flowing in, you know, and you'll see that in the Caribbean, you'll see that in Europe, you see that a lot, where the teacher kind of loses sight of why they're there doing what they're supposed to be doing, because either money or whatever the case may be, whatever their motive is in the background, it could be sexual, it could be a whole slew of things. And I feel that it's true that I feel so, my heart goes out to the scholars. My heart goes out to the individuals who are seeking knowledge and seeking teachers. And I think that's another reason why I'm so grateful for someone like you. You know, you come on, you have the videos, you have your website. I mean, you are giving so much information out for free. You are doing the legwork, the stuff that the initiate should be doing. You've done it for them, and you've put it on a beautiful platter for them to learn through. And I feel like that is just I'm grateful, and I hope that more people see that. If someone is deciding to do this in a solitary way, what are some tips and tricks that you could give them? What are some things that they could Google? I mean, aside from going to your books and to your YouTube, what are some other avenues that they can look for?
You know, what's interesting is what you said. It's very flattering, but unfortunately, I don't think I do any of the work for the beginner. What I think is I provide access to resources, and that's very, very different from helping. You know, I'm giving you access to resources, but you have to go and reap it. And I think only 1% of people are going to go do the work to reap, you know, the true potential of any of the knowledge that's out there. What I do is sort of, there's always been a history of gatekeeping or keeping things behind locked doors, which that part doesn't make any sense to me. I think if you have free access to that, then you have a choice to do the work and actually learn, or to not do the work, and that's meaningless. The access is meaningless. And so I don't believe in gatekeeping, because I believe that the gods gatekeep for us, you know. And if you look at it, no matter what, whether it's when, you know, how I learned, for example, in law school, school. That one teacher once said to me that she doesn't need to grade on a curve because students put themselves in the grading curve. There's always going to be the 1% that get the A's, the 10%. There's a whole bell curve of how students do in any course. You don't need to enforce it. They put themselves in the curve. Now take that into the real world application. It really is true. I mean, the exceptional individuals that just rise to the occasion is always going to be in the minority, and people put themselves in the bell curve, and that happens in esotericism as well, especially things that are behind the veil, right? There's the very few who decide, I'm going to really try and gain access and penetrate the veil. So I don't need to be a gatekeeper. Priests and priestesses do not need to be a gatekeeper. The gods gatekeep for themselves. So what was your question?
If they decide to be solitary, what are some tips and tricks? What are some helpful beginner study places? What should they be mindful of on their journey?
Okay. I would meditate for at least 10 minutes a day. Find a form of meditation that's comfortable with you. Don't be a superhero and try to do 2 hours of meditation if you've never meditated in your life. So just 10 minutes, and consider that a huge achievement. Don't try to be the hero, right? Do 10 minutes of meditation and really think about what you eat. Be those crazy Instagram people who are all about clean eating, right? But there's a kernel of truth there. Think about what you're eating. And I think something as practical as, okay, I no association with MyFitnessPal, but I just love MyFitnessPal because you can go into the function and see your macros and just take a look at your nutrients. Are you getting enough vitamin A, vitamin C, calcium, and iron, right? And just actually monitor your food and make sure that you're actually getting all of the macros and the nutrients that your body needs. And I think fairly quickly, people start to see, oh my God, I always lack iron. I'm always only at 16% iron every single day for the past 6 years of my life. And you quickly make adjustments to your routine diet so that you elevate your nutrient levels. And when you do that, automatically you're going to see an instant switch in your magical practice. Because if you're fatigued and exhausted, those things quickly accumulate into forms of mental health issues. And it's just a snowball effect. And if you have that, it's going to affect your magical practice. There's just no way around that. And so if you go back to the basics, instead of like, well, I'm going to, make this wand and do this crazy, ceremonial magical ritual out of this 15th century book, before you go there, just focus on your nutrient intake and make sure you're getting the right nutrients. Things like that make a huge difference. And then from there, I think you just have to take a leap. You really need to take a leap of faith. People always talk about how dangerous magic is. I don't think the beginner is powerful enough to summon demons and possess your entire family and bring darkness upon your entire ancestral. I just don't think, no offense, you just don't got the power for that. I think the worst thing that happens is it doesn't work. You don't get the job. You don't get the $5,000 that your money magic was trying to go for. That's the worst thing that's going to happen. I just don't. And if you're that much, I just don't think it's going to happen, And so don't be afraid of just being experimental and trying out different rituals. And I know this gets into a conversation about cultural appropriation, but I do believe in trying many different cultural traditions. I do believe in trying a diversity of practices because it very quickly gets you to understand core truths. I think you're going to start to see patterns in the common denominator across every single tradition. When I go to South America, I feel like I connect more to South American practitioners of witchcraft than I do Asians who are not interested in it at all. We speak the same language. And I think when you study other cultures, you're going to start to see that common denominator. And that's going to help you to start filtering all of that and forming your own personal gnosis. So don't be afraid to experiment and make sure your physical health in terms of nutrient levels are up there.
Oh, Belle, thank you so much. I can't believe the hour just flew by and I still have a million more questions and we never even got to the audience. If the audience has any questions, I have no idea. I didn't even look. I'm so
bad. We can try. We can try to answer questions.
But I will say, what are you doing? What are you up to? What are there any new adventures that you on? Any new books you might be writing? And just anything you want to share with us? Where can people find you? How can people connect to you? Talk about you for a few minutes.
Well, benebellwen.com. Before COVID and the social unrest hit, I was, super ambitious, super active, and doing a lot of different things. I think we're very sensitive to what goes on. And so like right now for me, it's more about just kind of coasting. I think, if the current, like for example, if you're in the middle of a storm, a typhoon, the best thing to do is to just figure out how to stay afloat, and stillness is very important. If you're thrashing around, no matter what you're trying to do, it's just not going to work because the greater extenuating forces are just too strong. And I think it's okay to admit that. Right. And so for me, I think the extenuating circumstances in the global crisis we see today is a little too strong for most of us. And so for me right now, it's about practicing stillness, learning how to stay afloat, and just coasting. So I'm not really doing anything overly ambitious at the moment. I'm not doing anything crazy or like rituals and stuff like that. I'm just trying to coast.
Well, I will tell this to all the audience. Trust me when I tell you, you got plenty of stuff to do if you pick up her books. Plenty of stuff to read if you go to her website, plenty of stuff to watch if you go to her YouTube channel. And as you guys continue to coast and relax, you'll be kind of absorbing, all of this wonderful information. And I just want to say to you, Belle, thank you so much again for saying yes to me, for coming on to the show. This conversation was insane. I don't know. How did you feel about it? I loved it.
I loved it. Yeah, I loved it. It was great connecting with you. I feel bad we didn't get to any of the questions.
To be honest, I'm actually scrolling through. There wasn't any. People were just so enthralled by what you were saying. People were just loving what you were saying. I think everyone was just absorbing. And that happens sometimes. It sure does. So again, I want to say thank you to Stephen and Ori and Marius, Susan, there's so many, Ananachi, there's just so many people here. Elba, thank you guys so much for joining us tonight. So in case you guys notice, hi Sean, thank you. I am doing this now only Saturdays versus last month I was doing it Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. So I was interviewing someone different 3 days out of the weekend. It was so much. So I just narrowed it down to Saturdays. So you're my first Saturday person. And what a way to kick it off. I will say, what a way. Thank you again. I hope you have a wonderful week.
Thank you for having me.
All right, guys, you know where to find us, benebellwen.com. If you want to seek out Benebell Wen over on YouTube channel. And of course, Leilani at The Magical Solution, YouTube, Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, you know where to go. Have a beautiful night, you guys, and thank you again. Bye.